there in that White House briefing room. But let's begin, though, with someone who we rarely really see, let alone briefing the press. It was the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson taking questions from the White House press corps, specifically on the news today that the Trump administration has decided to agree to designate North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. So I've got Michelle Kosinski and David Chalian and Sam Vinograd all here with me, and so. A couple of points just on the practical effect. It seemed like the Secretary of State was making the point that we have a lot of those actions already in place, implicit within this designation, and really this is for dissuading third parties from interactions with North Korea. But first, David, just on Rex Tillerson and the bizarre last couple of months, starting with the moron comment directed toward the president. What do you make of him and his appearance and just where we are today?
Starting with that and culminating with just last week, his spokesperson at the State Department indicating that there was indeed a problem with morale there at the State Department. So, yes, there is the fascination to watch the Secretary of State, who does not seem all that close to the president. He serves in the briefing room, speaking there from the White House. But I do think on the substance of what he was saying, Brooke, what was so interesting to hear him say is that while they were touting this new diplomatic step of reasserting this status for North Korea, he made clear this was not the end of the road of diplomatic options, and that this was just one in a series of steps to continue to ratchet up pressure, but by no means did he want it to be perceived that this was sort of like an ultimate exasperated moment of some final bit of diplomacy.
Michelle, to David's point on Heather Nauert on Friday, saying, it's acknowledging publicly that the poor morale at state. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Secretary of State would acknowledge that himself, and he didn't deny it today when we asked him a question specifically about that. But he did want to take that moment to turn around and stay before cameras during this photo op and say that he takes exception with anybody who feels that the State Department is not running well. I mean, he made a strong statement on that. But again, not denying that there's a morale problem. He said that his redesign, which has garnered some criticism and is seen by many as hurting morale, is actually going to fix the morale problem. So there's plenty of questions that remain on there too. But I think when you look at today, the dynamic here is always something to be watched. This afternoon, just before he headed to the White House, which was unexpected, at least among the press people here at State, he was asked by members of the press about this North Korea issue, because we already knew what the president had stated earlier. But the Secretary of State chose to remain completely silent on this while at the State Department, before the State Department press corps. He just turned around. He didn't even want to say, I'm going to have something to say about this in just a few minutes. I mean, he said nothing about it. Then he appears before the White House press corps and answers all kinds of questions. He even sort of tries to explain what is in this case and in other cases a slight difference in language that he has with the president. He said that he calls this the increase the pressure campaign, acknowledging that the president calls it the maximum pressure campaign. So he's saying that he has a slightly different view there, but he wanted to meld it all together and explain why he feels like this would be beneficial, even though we all know that there was some disagreement within the State Department over whether this was a good idea. But it tells you that this is policy that is clearly being directed, motivated by the White House. State Department obviously did the work on this and completed the process of adding them to the list. But this, it's very starkly obvious that this was not an idea that came from Secretary of State Tillerson or within the State Department, and they tried to push this through.
On the substance of the designation, Sam, let me just turn to you. Hearing essentially out of the gate the Secretary of State saying this is all an effort to, quote, turn up the pressure. But then one of the reporters asked the perfect question, which was, well, we thought he was sitting in Seoul speaking in the National Assembly just a couple weeks ago saying to North Korea, let's talk, come to the table. And if you have this now state sponsor of terrorism designation from North Korea, does that then negate any efforts of diplomacy? How do you see it?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Okay.
I think to deal with North Korea right now, the president is wisely using all tools in his toolkit. State sponsor designation is one way to increase the pressure, in Secretary Tillerson's words, while we also try to add credibility to an actual military strike if North Korea doesn't denuclearize. I was really struck by two things today in the Secretary's press briefing. The first is he said that this was a result of an interagency process, so we finally have a situation where the president is using his National Security Council and not making policy by tweet, which is something that I feel a little bit better about.
Step in the right direction.
Indeed, we'll take it. But I was also struck by the fact that Secretary Tillerson was pretty measured in
Yes.
how these sanctions would actually have an impact. He actually used the phrase, "there is no silver bullet," and I think that's smart. Nothing by itself is going to force North Korea to denuclearize right now. I think it's going to be a combination of factors.
Made the note on the measured tone. Be curious to see how the president potentially tweets about it. Let me move on, David Chalian. Let's switch gears and talk about Alabama and the Senate race. The White House, once again saying it's up to the people in the great state of Alabama really to be the ones to decide Roy Moore's fate. He is the candidate denying all these sexual assault allegations, but Sarah Sanders was questioned on the comment by Kellyanne Conway suggesting that they now want Moore to win to be able to use his vote for the tax bill.